name is Maxim Oillic, and I come from WindEurope. We are the European Trade Association for Wind Energy. We're based in Brussels, and our membership spans over the entire supply chain of wind energy, including national associations such as αιολική. So I take this opportunity to thank αιολική for organizing this event. So where is wind energy in Europe today? We have 255 gigawatts of wind energy installed. That's the total capacity in Europe, and that represents 17% of Europe's electricity demand. On the map, the blue bars show the capacity installed in each country, and the red bars, the wind share of electricity demand in the same countries. Here is the data for onshore wind and for offshore wind. I will start with a brief reminder of all the benefits wind energy brings to the environment in general. Wind is clean and sustainable. This will come as a surprise to no one here. It emits no air pollutants, uses very little water, and of course allows us to save huge amounts of greenhouse gases. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see how long it takes for a wind farm to pay back the energy it required for its construction, its operations, and its disposal, so the entire life cycle of a wind farm. Here you have the data for hydro and solar PV, natural gas, nuclear, and coal. Up to 90% of a wind turbine is recyclable. Wind turbines are made of mostly steel and concrete. There are two well-known materials which have established recycling practices. The remaining bit regards the blades. Because they're made of composite materials, they are a bit more challenging to recycle, but the industry is working hard in finding solutions, and we're seeing now announcements by manufacturers to recycle existing blades, but also come up with new blades that can be fully recyclable from the start. At WindEurope, we collaborate closely with the Chemicals Industry Association, CEFIC, and the European Composites Association, UCIA, into making sure that this happens in the coming years. So, of course, all those benefits globally of wind energy, at local level, wind energy, like any other human activity, can have adverse effect on its local environment and local biodiversity. What do we do about this? Well, the first thing has been mentioned many times throughout the day is to prevent most of the impacts through adequate planning, siting, and design of the wind farms. This allows us to avoid the vast majority of negative impacts at local level. It, of course, includes the environmental impact assessments, which are required for every project, and in protected areas, appropriate assessments. For those impacts that could not be completely avoided, there are additional measures to mitigate them. We have heard from Mr. Kouvelis, who has given, again, a lot of examples of all the mitigation measures in place and those to come. I will not go into detail. There are many technologies available, but what is key to remember is all those mitigation measures are very site-specific and species-specific. There is no one model that applies to all wind farms. It is not always necessary. Once again, it's a second step in the mitigation hierarchy. Finally, as also mentioned by Mr. Kouvelis, those remaining impacts that could not be avoided or mitigated are compensated through restoration projects and offsetting. Here is an example from the UK where a developer proposed to help kill rats on a small island where puffins are nesting as a compensation and offsetting measure for some of the remaining impacts that are happening at one of their wind farms. Continuous monitoring, as required also by the environmental legislation at European level, of course, and that was also mentioned by Paulo in the case of Portugal, monitoring remains key throughout the entire lifetime of the wind farm to ensure that all the impacts are constantly reassessed and monitored. So, in summary, and we've heard that before, avoid, minimize, compensate is a clear mitigation hierarchy followed by the industry. Now, wind and biodiversity also work hand in hand and can have clear, mutually beneficial, mutual benefits between each other. This is an example from Ireland, where onshore wind farms are managed in a way that can attract pollinators and thus enhance the entire ecosystem of the site. We have two more examples from Belgium and the Netherlands, where mussels and oysters are being grown on the cables between offshore turbines and on their foundations, also contributing to a healthy marine environment. Now, we need more wind energy. We have heard this morning from the Green Deal, this is Ursula von der Leyen proposing, or rather saying what the Green Deal strategy is going to be in 2019, with the objective of achieving net zero greenhouse gases emissions by 2050, and still Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, last year talking about Repower EU, which is Europe's strategy to achieve energy security, of course, in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In fact, the EU wants 440 gigawatts of wind energy by 2030, up from 255 gigawatts today. But Europe is not building enough wind. This is how much Europe has built up to last year. This is how much we expect Europe is going to build. And this is what we should be building in order to meet our two targets of energy security and climate. You can see that at the end of the decade, it's even more. What is the problem? Permitting is a problem. Permitting of wind farms is too slow and too complex. The EU and national governments know about this and are taking action. Some of the packages have been mentioned this morning, the emergency regulation that was adopted last year for the permitting of renewable projects, and some provisions that were also proposed as part of the Repower EU strategy, which will be integrated into the Renewable Energy Directive. The negotiations and discussions at European level are now taking place. Three key enablers that can solve permitting. Granting all renewable energy projects of overriding public interest. We've also heard the concept earlier today. Taking a population-based approach to biodiversity, and being clear on the permitting deadlines. So how would those three key enablers that could solve permitting and accelerate the build-out that we need to reach our targets interact with nature protection legislation? Most of these, again, have been mentioned earlier, the historical directives at European level, birds and habitats, the Natura 2000 network. The EU is also now working on a 2030 biodiversity strategy with a proposal of granting some form of protection to 30% of land and sea, 10% of which would be strictly protected. That means where no human activity can take place. Discussions are also happening on this. And finally, the nature restoration law. Restoration is also key, with a proposal to grant 20% of land and sea with restoration measures. Most probably those would be part of the overall 30% within the biodiversity strategy. So if we take them one by one, overriding public interest, what does this mean? And how can this help? Overriding public interest sends a clear and strong political signal that renewable energy is in the interest of us all to meet our climate targets and to meet our energy security goals. This someone mentioned this morning again that biodiversity and renewable energy are the two sides of the same coin. This is really what this is about. It's about ensuring that we deliver the amount of renewable energy we need with the highest possible environmental protection standards. Overriding public interest would not lessen the need to do environmental impact assessments or appropriate assessments. And as it comes for the Article 6.4 of the Habitats Directive, which has been mentioned by Mrs. Sakak and Mr. Papas earlier, again, it's only one of the three conditions that public authorities need to put forward in order to derogate to the Habitats Directive. So it does not grant everything automatically. Overriding public interest would be the first condition that would be met if this is granted in general, but governments, or rather public authorities, would still have to prove that there is no alternative option and would still have to take mitigation and compensation measures. Population-based approach. What does this mean? This means looking at the entire population of species. We've heard that also in Paolo's presentation, rather than just specimens. In fact, this is already the spirit in the Birds and Habitats Directive, but in some member states it has been interpreted as a specimen approach, which means that a single fatality can block an entire project regardless of the overall health of the species population. Population-based approach, again, does not lessen the need to take mitigation measures, with all the examples that we've heard earlier. It does not lessen the need to monitor. And in fact, it can in fact bring more options in terms of mitigation. The example from the UK with the rats is a concrete example where a developer can act at population level by offsetting some of the compensation measures in another site. Finally, wind farms can really act as active restoration areas. So in the 20% that would be proposed of areas of land and sea where restoration measures are taken, that would be passive and active restoration measures. Passive restoration measures meaning no activity, we just leave the site as it is, but active meaning where action can be taken, human-made action can be taken in order to enhance the restoration of an area. Well, we have all the examples from island, pollinators, and also, of course, at sea that I mentioned earlier that can really play a role in there. The Ocean Coalition, which WindEurope is involved with, is a coalition of NGOs, the wind industry, transmission system operators are working closely on this. Ευχαριστώ.